welcome back. And thank you to Philip for leading that opening discussion there. Some food for thought in terms of where we're heading and what to expect. Quick update for everyone that's watching the Swapcard platform. I've just been notified that there is a slight misorder on the agenda that is on the Swapcard platform. That is due to a software technical glitch. If you're looking for the running order, please refer to the main website, which you've probably been looking at for the last couple of weeks for the main running order. All of the timings are correct. They've just appeared in a slightly different order for some reason. Without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to welcome our first keynote panel of the day. We reflect on 2021 so far and ponder the road ahead for North American wind operations. This panel will be moderated by Edmee Kelsey, who's the CEO of 3 Megawatt, and Edmee will be joined by Gerrud Wallaert, RWE Renewables Americas, Zavesoff from ClearWay Energy, Melf Lorenzen from Deutsche Windtechnik, and Kevin Polo of CPS Energy. There will be time for Q&A, so please do get your questions in using the Q&A box that you see to the side of the video player right now. And don't forget to use the hashtag #OMDallas when sharing your thoughts on either Twitter or LinkedIn. Without further ado, I'd like to hand the virtual stage to Edmee. Thanks very much.
Thank you, John. Thank you for the introduction and welcome to everybody from all over the world. I noticed that we have attendees not only from the US, but also from Europe. So welcome everybody. And thank you for your interest. We have a really good panel this morning, and I would like to take the opportunity to have everybody introduce themselves at the beginning of their first question. But I'd also like to say that we're very much looking forward to your questions. So please send in your questions so that we can spend some time at the end of the session to go through them. A few words about myself. As John said, I'm the CEO and founder of 3 Megawatt. We joined the Power Factors organization not too long ago, 3 months ago, together with Greenbyte, whom many of you may know as a wind asset performance monitoring system. And altogether, we manage about 120 I always do that. I say gigabyte, but I mean gigawatt. And I'm sure you're not the only ones, that I'm not the only one doing that. But about 120 gigawatts of renewable assets worldwide. And so with that, we've been looking at trends and changes in 2021. And I'd be very curious to ask each of you what you thought was different in 2021. And I think we shouldn't talk about the pandemic, but in general, other trends and things that you see that are affecting your business. And I would like to start with Gerrud.
Thanks, Edna. And also just appreciation for John Harmon and the Reuters group for hosting this event. I do always appreciate kind of the hard work that the group has done and also the platform to have these types of discussions. Maybe a little bit about myself. So I do work for RWE. We are a kind of a generator owner operator globally. And so we have 12 gigawatts and growing of renewable assets focused on onshore, offshore wind, also solar and battery storage. My role within the organization is really to provide technical leadership within the engineering section of the Americas. And so we support development, construction, and operations with the civil electrical instrument controls and turbine engineering organization. Been with the company for about 10 years. Obviously, engineering is my latest role, but I have been part of and still significantly supporting the operations colleagues as well. To dive in on your question though, 2021, what is new? I think some of the trends that we are seeing, you'll probably hear from the other panelists as well, but just to put them on the table, I think we're starting to see significant stress on the workforce. And what I mean by that, right? Everyone within the industry is growing. And so with growth comes great opportunity, but it also, I would say, puts a burden in regards to kind of the staff that we have and also trying to get new talent in, as again, we're not also a new industry at the same time, right? So we do have an aging workforce. We do have individuals that want to move into other roles. And so trying to balance the movements internally, trying to make sure that we're growing well as a company and also as an industry, I think is one of the key points that we continue to see, not only from the front line, but also when you look at just all roles. and also specifically leadership, and really finding those next generation leaders to continue to come in and continue the trajectory. I think that's the other side of the sustainability aspect that we look at, right? It's not only what are we doing on the renewable side, but also how do we create the sustainability within the leadership dynamic and making sure that we continue that trajectory. I think the other dynamic that we're also seeing is a bit of a strain on just parts, logistics, transportation, right? It's no surprise as we especially look into the overall market that we are seeing upward pressure when it comes to spare parts, the commodity prices, transportation costs are increasing. And so how do we take that challenge and actually use it as a moment of maybe innovation and inspiration to really challenge the status quo, or some of the dynamics there? So I could go on, but I'll stop for the moment. We have other panelists, so happy to pass the baton here.
Great, thank you, Gerrud. Yes, that's true. You probably don't want to steal their thunder. Good points on the workforce. I think all industries are suffering, but I think renewables, particularly with our growth rate and the increasing installed base, are suffering a lot. And spare parts, I think it's also generic to renewables, and we hear you. I think it's going to be interesting, and I'd like to ask a follow-up question later on to see what kind of process you have in place to mitigate this challenge. I'd like to move on to Paul. Paul, please introduce yourself and also maybe share with us what kind of trends you're seeing for 2021.
Absolutely, my pleasure. So my name is Paul Zavesoff. I'm Senior Director of Asset Management with ClearWay Energy. ClearWay Energy is one of the largest developers and owners of clean energy in the United States. Been with the company for over 10 years, and with ClearWay Energy and its predecessor, Energy Renewables. My team is responsible for commercial and fiscal management of our utility scale assets, solar and wind. We have about close to 1,500 megawatts of solar, utility scale solar, and about 3.5 gigawatts of wind energy. And we're responsible for the P&L of those facilities. In terms of the challenges in 2021, so yeah, the same trends that we've seen in prior years, they continue to intensify, and were added by the pressure of COVID. We've seen less pressure on the O&M side, more on the construction side from COVID-related effects. Delay some of our construction partners declared force majeures due to COVID reasons. Of course, also mentioned increase in, pressure on parts, pressure on prices. Another big event for us was the February storm in Texas, which, took us by surprise. It may have been a black swan event, but, with climate change trends, I think that's something that we should be prepared to face in the future. And, we're actively working on, various measures in terms of preparing our facilities to better withstand similar events, in terms of better managing market risks that are associated with such events. So this will be, a major theme for us in the coming, few years. Another trend that we see intensifies in 2021 is increased congestion in the major markets. Transmission congestion and the resulting, increase in curtailments. And, that's something that we need to address because, although on many contracts that we have, this is compensable, we have also contracts where it's not compensable. So we need to address, and, as the rest of the industry, how we deal with this. It becomes a major challenge for everybody. Especially in, Panhandle in Texas and some other markets. So that's what I would say about 2021 so far.
Thank you, Paul. And Kevin, I'm really sorry. I think that that Paul has taken two big issues that probably were marking 2021 for you off the list, talking about the winter storm, but also about congestion. Do you agree with Paul? And do you have any other challenges or trends specific to Texas and that you would like to add?
Sure. So again, as the other Gerrud and Paul have said, thank you to Reuters for inviting me. Very excited about the opportunity to speak today. My name is Kevin Polo. I'm the Vice President for Energy Supply and Market Operations for CPS Energy. So we are the municipally owned utility. We serve the city of San Antonio and surrounding areas. My team manages all of our daily interaction with the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, the ERCOT. We're scheduling all of our generation resources, do all of our energy and fuel trading. My team also handles our long-term planning, so our demand forecasting as well as our generation planning. So when we look at things that are new for us and exciting for us in 2021, one of the things that we're very focused on is what we call our flexible path, which is essentially our integrated resource plan, but it's our approach to transitioning our generation fleet to low and non-emitting resources. We started that journey, although we formally launched Flexible Path in 2018. We really started our journey about 20 years ago. We made our first investment in wind. We've got about over 1,000 megawatts of wind under contract now. We've got about 550 megawatts of solar. So we've made a strong commitment as far as renewable generation and where it fits into our portfolio. Our next step in that flexible path journey, which is really what our focus has been on here for 2021, is what we call our Flex Power Bundle. But we're looking to add up to 900 megawatts of solar, and 50 megawatts of energy storage, and 500 megawatts of firming capacity. Really, the first step there is to replace some aging gas-fired generation units. We've had a very strong industry response. We got nearly 200 responses, different projects that responded to the RFP. So we are looking to move from evaluation of the RFP into actually awarding contracts. So it's been a very exciting project for us, this year. As far as other trends that we're seeing, I do think within Texas, within ERCOT, one of the things we continue to see is a very strong growth in both wind and solar. ERCOT now has about 27,000 megawatts of installed wind capacity. We've added, I think, about 7,000 megawatts or so just this year alone, and it's grown about 67% in terms of the last 5 years. So we see that growth continuing. Solar is starting to pick up in the same way, and so from a market perspective, it has a couple of different effects that we're working through and managing. One is, kind of an overall suppression of prices. It helps to keep prices down over the long term. We also see it adding to price volatility, right? Where when the wind or the solar do not perform, then we tend to see a lot of price spikes, particularly in our real-time market. So those are a couple of the trends that actually have started, not just this year, but have definitely continued into 2021. And we view that as key risk management activities for us to focus on as we move forward.
Thank you, Kevin. And Melf, from your perspective, I assume that you, as a service provider, you will resonate with the rest of the team that probably access to workforce and spare parts are issues. What other trend do you agree with that? And are there any other things that specifically affect you, perhaps more than others, as a service provider?
Yeah, thank you, Edmee. And a few words maybe to myself. So I'm Melf Lorenzen. I'm with DWT, Deutsche Windtechnik. We are an independent service provider serving around 12 gigawatts globally between European, the US and Asian markets, and operate onshore as well as offshore, and provide operation maintenance services to wind farm asset owners, whether under long-term service agreements or as a la carte services like major component changeouts and up-tower repairs. What other trends do we see? Back to the question, Edmee. I think one that has not been brought up yet is actually the political tailwinds. I think have never been any stronger than they are like today for clean power. We see actually a political election in Germany coming up in the upcoming weekend. And even where just climate change and the energy transition are the absolute key topic of the election. And beyond that, we have seen the Biden administration coming up with a very robust and very ambitious plan to go zero carbon for the US economy by 2050. And beyond that, we also have seen other governments, other countries coming up with very strong commitments towards zero carbon. So I think overall, the political tailwinds have never been any stronger than they are today. With that, there comes a lot of challenges, obviously. I think the Texas freeze that we have witnessed earlier this year, not to go into too much detail there, but I think also we've seen some of the challenges. And I think it's on the industry now that we evolve from a very minor contribution of primary energy provider now to the ultimately largest portion, to set the bar high, the quality standards high, because if we don't do it ourselves, ultimately there will be others coming in and doing it for us. Mm-hmm. So I think the expectations have risen a lot. With the strong support, we do see in the US that at least expected for this year, we see more solar capacity going online than onshore wind. And beyond that, starting next year, we see offshore wind really evolving a lot. So with that, we have a lot of new capacity going online. And I think feeding off what Gerrud already mentioned earlier, yes, we have a very strong demand in clean energies across the board for talent, in particular in those regions where we actually install the clean power plants. And not wanting to stress this point once again too much, I know everybody has heard it already a lot, but COVID, whether it is to direct infection or it might be some quarantining actually after a potential exposure, we see actually that a significant part of our workforces is impacted still, which of course doesn't help at all. Plus, in particular for the US speaking, we see an overall economy recovery stronger than after many crises we've seen in the past. So there is definitely a very strong demand for workforce, and it's continuing to be for the upcoming 10 to 20 years. Possibly at a certain point, we have technology will help us, and we can automate certain parts of it, because just if we think of the numbers, to provide 100% of primary energy with the clean power source we have available at hand today, it's almost unthinkable, you know, in terms of workforce, what it takes if we had the same ratio, basically of how many wind turbines can be served by one technician or a team. So I think automation will help us, but for the next 10 to 15 years ahead of us, we certainly need a very strong amount of talent actually into our industry.
Great, thank you, Melf. Very uplifting. Absolutely right. We have big tailwinds at the moment, and we should take advantage of it. When it comes to the workforce, yes, it's true. There are lots of new tools coming out for automation. I mean, this is very dear to my heart because that's what we do at 3 Megawatt. And I know that there's a session later on. So if people who are interested in software, please stay on for a session later on software. But I'd like to go sort of as a next step deeper into the trends that you've addressed and the challenges, and to find out how you as an organization are looking at those challenges and how to potentially mitigate those risks. And for that, I'd like to start with Paul. And we talked about curtailment risk, congestion. Is there anything that you can do as an organization to sort of anticipate this, or do you have any strategies in-house to deal with this congestion risk, or you just take it as it comes?
Yeah, it's a complex question. I mean, long term, you know, you can plan for it by adding storage and better planning of transmission routes to your facilities. But near term, there is not really much you can do about it, other than you need to run your facilities in the way that maximize production when they can, and having the controllers that are able to quickly respond to the GMS signals that you receive from your partners, offtake partners. And luckily, most of our facilities they have compensable curtailment provision in the contract. So the issue becomes really to differentiate compensable from non-compensable. And people may be familiar in a typically economically related congestion and curtailments is compensable, but reliability, stuff that is driven by transmission, by emergency, it's not compensable. But the line is pretty, gray between the two areas. So, we have to negotiate many times with our partners, what part of the congestion of the curtailment is compensable, what is not, and you need to have better data. It goes to 30 seconds intervals of your production, so you need to show like clearly what you could have produced and what you produce in reality, and prove it to be able to collect those compensable curtailment. So that's
interest. Do you ever have any disputes for that? So you say
we routinely have disputes. It never gets like the real serious disputes, but yeah, I mean, almost we need to dispute every invoice. And it's all about data. It's all about different data points and comparing our data to the data of our off-takers. And but we're able to settle over 90% of curtailment with our partners.
So, and sorry, I'm digging a little bit deeper because this is very interesting, I think, for the audience. So when there is a dispute, are there any factors specifically that you can point to, maybe in terms of miscommunication or something where a dispute can originate? Maybe the timestamps are slightly different or offset, or are there any themes, or is it just every time something different?
Yeah, I mean, we have our flags in our control system that shows when we were curtailed, and we have a log of different events that triggered those curtailment, and we compare this data set to our off-takers, and we go each event by event and classify whether it was reliability or it's economic. And in some markets there could be some overlap between the two. The economic market signals that create curtailment, and their transmission related signals that create curtailment. So those gray areas where there's an overlap, we usually have like to agree on some sharing of the risk.
Kevin, are you involved with that as well? And because I assume maybe sometimes you're at the other side of the fence, and that you because you're a PPA off-taker in some cases too, and that you have to evaluate this from a different perspective. Is that correct? And are you faced with these issues?
You are correct. We do see similar concerns from a congestion standpoint. I would say it impacts us in a couple of different ways. As I said, it's a large off-taker of wind and solar. Those tend to be remotely located, not within the city of San Antonio. So that price difference between where we're buying our energy and the price is locally to serve the load, it's a cost to our customers that we have to manage very closely. We have couple of different tools we use, within the market construct. ERCOT, we're able to procure congestion revenue rights, which is an important tool for us to use to manage congestion. I'd say the other thing that's very important is just forecasting. Again, with the variability in production, being able to forecast certainly as accurately as we can on a day-ahead basis, the output we expect from each of our wind farms becomes very important, and how we're able to schedule that into our market and how we use it to serve our load. As Paul was saying, with curtailment's become a big issue for us as well. And as he said, the contracts have different provisions, and we're very careful at looking at when curtailments, economic curtailments, maybe We may still owe the wind farm, for that production that wasn't energy that wasn't produced, and it becomes a data exercise in a way. As Paul said, there's a lot of different factors that we have to figure out as far as time on starts and stops of events. How was that communicated, to the provider, as well as just looking again at how you calculate the wind that didn't actually get produced because the resource was curtailed. So we've worked through a number of challenges early on, I think, in terms of just establishing some methodologies and ways to calculate that. I think once we were able to do that, individually with each of the resource and resource owners, we've gotten to a pretty good spot where I would say we have fewer challenges on a month-to-month basis with our invoices, but it is something as a utility we do pay attention to very closely every month.
Great, I can imagine. And just to ask a little bit deeper, so you said forecasting is really important, and as we all know, wind forecasting is not easy. Do you have any tips that you could share with the audience about why you think that maybe something you found in the process that would make it easier for somebody who wants to do good wind forecasting?
Well, I think it continues to be a challenge. We utilize, I would say, multiple forecasts. Many of our resources provide us a forecast of their production. ERCOT publishes a forecast that we incorporate into our systems and our processes as well. We're looking at just the meteorological, the weather forecast for each of the areas where our wind farms are. Particularly, that becomes important. And we've talked about the winter storm event, for example. So that becomes very important, and we track closely as we get into winter season, just fronts as they move across the state, which ones are bringing precipitation, which ones are not, because that freezing events and at the wind farms, whether they're the same as we had in February, or whether they're a much more mild event, but still, anything that brings freezing rain and such can affect the output of the wind turbine. So we tend to watch those very closely, because that affects ultimately what we expect out of that resource and how we plan for that resource to produce or not produce, in real time, as well as the next day as we're planning our portfolio for that to meet our load.
Thank you. Maybe changing gears a little and going back to Gerrud. I mean, one of the things that you mentioned, Gerrud, is the issue with spare parts, and I imagine that will only get worse. I mean, you have the current supply issue, but you also have an aging fleet. Can you share with us within RWE what kind of approach do you have in terms of mitigating this risk?
Yeah, good question. And I would say we're still in the throes of it, but maybe just to touch back on the curtailment point just for a moment. I did used to work for an RTO ISO back in a previous life. And I think that the issues that we're dealing with and the discussions that we've had here are very much more kind of short-term, medium-term. How do we continuously improve? And that's why I appreciate kind of the points both Paul and Kevin made. I do think, though, and also tying to a point that Melf made, right? The infrastructure bill also then touches on transmission, and transmission we know doesn't get built overnight. And so hopefully we can start to look at this dynamic from multiple different areas, from the generation to the utilities, from also the RTO space, to make sure that we are working together to create that longer term path, to make sure that we're taking the signals that we're seeing here with the efficiencies of curtailment and figuring out what that new era needs to look like, right? So we are in the midst of a transition. Kevin, you used the term kind of flexible as part of what CPS is looking at there. And I think that's going to be the dynamic of flexibility leading into more of a longer term plan that hopefully we're growing together as an industry as we meet the future needs. I think back on the parts dynamic, I think, yeah, go ahead. I thought I heard someone else speaking there. On the parts dynamic, I think what's important is, one, setting up a culture of really looking at the issue from multiple different perspectives, right? There's many different suppliers out there in the marketplace. All of them are looking at it differently. There are opportunities that you can start to give a bit more of a guarantee to certain providers, which helps them with their planning and helps mitigation. So really almost partnering with somebody. RWE also looks at what can we do in-house. And I know this isn't a strategy for all, but when you start to get to a certain scale and size, especially with certain technologies, it's a logical question to ask of, can we bring any of that work in-house of refurbishment, really diagnosing kind of some of the parts issues, and what can we do to really make sure that we're putting downward pressure using our own expertise and skills as well. And so when you look at that dynamic, you're really looking at what levers can you really pull from that perspective, looking at the issue holistically. And I think the other part, and again, we're still growing in this dynamic, is really understanding and forecasting what parts may become obsolete, looking at the marketplace as a whole to understand, is this a short-term issue, long-term issue, and really stress testing our strategies as we move along. So from the perspective, and just maybe to bottom line, I don't think that there's one silver bullet. I think that you have to really set up a system and a culture that looks at this holistically, really with the longer term view, to make sure that we're set up for success long term. So again, I could go on about this, but I'll stop for the moment. I'm sure Melf may have a view on this part's dynamic as well.
Right, but before we go to Melf, just maybe out of interest a little bit, I'd like to dig a little bit deeper. So,
sure.
Where in the organization would this sit? Like, who is the person who looks at like the longevity of spare parts and at the suppliers? And so, I mean, is that in operations, or you already on the EPC you kind of have a plan in place? I mean, where does this live? Where does it get maintained?
Yeah, and that's also part of the complexity, right? And so internally, we've really set up a dynamic to where operations, engineering, and procurement are working quite closely together. Because when you look at it, you really need all three of those groups working together, not only to handle the issues of the here and now, but also to plan it long term, right? So you have those that replace the parts. Engineering is more responsible for the reliability of these components and really the root cause to understand the dynamics. And procurement, as we've discussed, has that dynamic of understanding the options in the marketplace and also challenging kind of the internal dynamics as well. So when you look at that, I think all three groups have an equal part in really creating that journey together. You've also touched on, hey, when you're actually constructing the site or even developing, how do you really make sure that that also plays into the long-term view? And again, the same groups are involved in that discussion. It's not something that I would say we're best in class at the moment on, but it is starting to become that dynamic of, all right, what's the need of our existing fleet long term? And as we look at the growth, does that growth change any of the dynamics or the strategies that we're starting to deploy in the short, medium, and long term? And again, we're starting to have those discussions, but that's the type of culture as well that you're asking. Not only what are the needs in the moment, but what do we need over the next 20, 25, 30 years, and really marrying that together for a holistic strategy.
Great, thank you. Melf, I assume your clients have similar issues. Are you managing the spare parts for your clients, or they do that and you just use them and you find missing ones? Or how, as a service provider, what is your exposure to the spare parts challenge? And
yeah, either way. So there is certain asset owners that bring in the parts themselves. However, globally speaking, I think 70% of the portfolio we bring actually in the spare parts. So the exposure is quite significant on our end as well. And beyond the trends that Gerrud has highlighted, there is another trend speaking, let's say, for the last 8 years in the US. We've seen a very significant concentration on the manufacturer's market as onshore wind has matured. And with that, there is practically in the US, we have 4 OEMs left between GE, Siemens, Vestas, and Nordic Acciona. And then there is some Goldwind. And beyond that, historically, though, there have been 5 to 8 more different platforms that have been installed in the US. And most asset owners still find having some of those more exotic turbine platforms in their operational portfolio, where the manufacturer, turbine manufacturer, has seized the market. And even some of the original spare part providers, whether it be pitch cylinders, whether it be certain motors, other parts in those turbines, have discontinued the service. So even the original part manufacturers are no longer in the market available. So with that, it's still a significant portion of the operational fleet here in the United States, and so also in other European markets. And that actually by itself is a huge challenge. So what we do there, typically we see three different strategies how we cope with that. One is we see an uptake actually in repair and overhaul instead of just change out of components, truly have those components actually refurbished and bring them back into life. The other trend that we see is repurposing, in particular here in the United States, as we've witnessed the tremendous repowering over the last years. Some of the equipment can be repurposed after a certain overhauling again and repair of the components, and will actually be gained back into other turbines. And then the third trend is truly finding alternatives, right? So alternative equipment that can be used on the same platform, which actually is a heavy involvement of the engineering team to find actually those alternatives. So with that, yes, in particular on those platforms where original manufacturer has seized the market, it is quite a challenge to still find the appropriate equipment, ideally even upgrade the equipment to find the answer to some of those root causes that continuously cause loss of energy, which obviously for numerous businesses inside the wind industry, whether it be DWT ourselves or it be other service providers, at the same time provides a great opportunity also to provide those engineering services to the asset owners.
Great. And so we have some great questions coming in from the audience. And one question kind of slightly touches on things that you've just discussed. So maybe, you know, it's for all the panelists, but maybe you want to go first. It's the question is whether an OEM multi-brand strategy is advantageous or not for an asset owner. Do you have any thoughts on that?
So to answer this one politically correct, I think in general the overall competition in the market space on operation and maintenance is truly one of the key drivers for lower cost of electricity in the last decade that we've seen, the big decline in levelized cost of energy. There is two major drivers. One for sure is larger capacity per turbine. The other one though is better operational strategies. You know, just thinking back 10 years ago, and I was myself with a manufacturer at those times, whenever an asset owner installed the GE turbine, there was basically one number you could call for operation and maintenance services. And it was the same for Vestas, the same for Siemens or any other platform that you had installed. So over the time, we had now a significant number of independent service providers now offering their services to the market, whether it be a full scope service like DWT provides, whether it be a la carte services or very specialized services, even you know, focusing on a certain component like the gearbox, the drivetrain, etc. So that is definitely one of the big drivers. We've seen manufacturers providing also services for not their own brand, so multi-brand, which again raises the competitive level. And we've also seen some of the asset owners that historically have maintained their own fleet to provide those services to third-party other asset owners. So in general, though, I must say, I think it's good for the overall market that we have all these options available. I think all have their the right for their existence. And there is certain scenarios where the one or the other strategy might be more advantageous to the asset owner.
Any of the other panelists have a view on this that they would like to share? And yeah, I can speak for ClearWay. You know, we work with all of the major OEMs in the space, obviously, and you know, we appreciate everybody. It's good to have a competition, you know, both in terms of pricing and technology that they can provide. On the operational side, our strategy was always try to self-operate as much as we can. You know, obviously during the warranty period, we need to rely on the OEM to provide, you know, the services. But as soon as the project is out of warranty, you know, we try to self-operate, and that's our way to reduce cost. You know, and for this you need a trained labor force, and that's been our focus.
Yeah, maybe to dovetail off of that, I mean, RWE is very similar, right? I mean, we've been self-performed for quite some time, so, and we do have technologies from each of the major OEMs and continue to look at it from that dynamic. I think that the competition, I think, has been good for the marketplace, right? And there's obviously been clear winners and losers, but I do think that the competition makes us ensure that the product and the services provided are valuable. And I think we've seen an increase in the value from that perspective and also a challenge on the cost. I think the other dynamic at play is as well, is that, and why we typically self-perform is we can create the culture around kind of the dynamics and how we service. And so actually the sharing of the best practices, the training, the safety culture, these are all dynamics that, again, are very important in the decision-making process, even though when we typically look at service agreements, it's typically what's the guarantees that we're getting and what's the cost of the service. But I think some of the dynamics around safety and really the partnerships will continue to matter. Some more of those softer dynamics. And I think those will continue to play out in the marketplace as we continue to evolve.
Great. Another question that we have, and it's a little bit technical question. I'm not really sure if it's easy to answer, because it's probably, it depends. The question is, how much of a factor is the loss of efficiency because of erosion or vibration? And so I don't know if anybody has an answer, great, but I think it really much depends probably on which turbine and where. But the interesting part of the question then is also like, what is being done to address these issues? And I do not know if any of you would like to comment or answer this question.
So let me start the conversation. Yeah, I mean, you've already alluded to it. It does depend, right, in regards to what does the erosion look like, the vibrations, et cetera. I think the important aspect is that we're having the discussion, right? And so these are dynamics that, again, a maturing industry has in regards to where are we losing efficiency, and then what do we need to do, if anything, to ensure that we're addressing it. Right, so when you think of erosion, you're talking about, at least the first thing that comes to mind is just the blades and the dynamic. And so we, as RWE, have really started a clear campaign of really going inspecting our blades on a fairly regular basis, trending those over time. And then we have the analytics team really help us to understand how much of a production loss are we seeing from that dynamic. So you've got the reliability of the blades coming into that picture, also the economics of the lost production. And then the question is, well, what's the right maintenance strategy to address those blades? And then you have power prices come into dynamics, the PTCs, and where the asset life is in regards to that curve, you know, the cost of the repairs, and all of these variables come into a decision and a strategy that I think really will be slightly different depending on the company and their structure as well. Similar to vibrations, right? You go down the same path. I don't think there's a one size fits all, but I think as the companies, and again, RWE is no exception here, reflect on it and mature, I think you'll figure out really where that sweet spot is. And again, to pick on Kevin's term of flexibility, we need to be flexible with the dynamics that we're seeing in the marketplace with the cost, and making sure we continue to address that accordingly as well.
Right, we're coming towards the end of our panel, and unfortunately it's always like this, the good questions come in right at the end, and we won't have time to answer them all, so sorry. Maybe one that we could take, if you have a view. There's a question how much you should allocate for blade maintenance as a percentage of your total O&M budget. Would anybody like to venture an answer for that one?
Lot of silence. I would not go forward with a percentage. I really think it comes down to exactly what we discussed there, thinking through the dynamics of blade integrity, what you're losing in production. And again, you just need to figure out what's right size for the economics of each of your assets and as a fleet, and then make the decision from there. There's many companies out there that can help you with that if you definitely need help.
Great. Maybe a final question right at the end to squeeze in. It looks like from somebody who's sort of newer to the industry. And the question is whether maybe some factors to assess whether it's better to in-house or outsource operations or O&M.
I think it depends on a lot of factors.
I know what you're going to answer.
So I believe it depends on a lot of factors. One definitely is the volume. So there is a lot of support elements that need to be developed in order to support field operations, all the way from the documentation up to the specialty tooling, to the back-end engineering, the spare parts, and the training system, and so on and so forth. So volume definitely comes into play. To have certain volume, and not only general volume, but have it on a certain platform, a certain concentration, ideally in a certain regional area, certain concentration. So that will help. On top of that, I think also it depends on the age, and it depends on the constellation of ownership, whether there is PTC involvement, whether it is a risk-averse ownership, or rather somebody that is hands-on and is absolutely keen to take operational risks. And beyond that, I believe it really depends also on technology, whether it's actually readily available in the market. If it's a fairly new turbine platform, where there is not as much technology available yet in the market to service those, it might be more of a challenge to self-perform rather than bringing them on at a later stage.
Great, thank you. Unfortunately, we've reached the end of our panel, and thank you so much to all of you for your very valuable insights. Unfortunately, we cannot clap because we're still virtual, but thank you again, and back to you, John.
Thank you very much, Edmee, and agreed. Thank you very much to the panel for joining us today. There's definitely some food for thought there coming through, and to the audience as well. There were a lot of questions that were coming through towards the end there. What I'll do is I'll make sure they are put in front of the panel, and then we will get some communications back out to you, our audience. But keep it up. That's really great. So as I said, thank you to Edmee, thank you to the panel. Moving on to our next topic, we have a look at too much data after inspection, a guide towards efficient data management and O&M budget optimization. This is a discussion led by Jay Choi, who's a co-founder and CEO of Nerf Lab in South Korea. And he'll be joined by Bjorn Hedges, who's the plant manager at White Creek Wind and Harvest Wind Project. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Jay and also to Bjorn. Take it away.